Hey guys, Political Junkie 2414 here, and welcome back to another 2024 election-related video. I'm sorry I haven't been more active in the last couple weeks before this historic election, but I promise, that I will set aside some time to make more content. And I've just been very busy. It's not that I've been lazy. I've just been incredibly exhausted and tired by things going on in my personal life. But nonetheless, today we are going to be putting out probably my second or third to last update for my predictions for the 2024 Senate elections. These are very competitive. This is a very competitive race, just like the presidential. The race for the White House and the House of Representatives, but Republicans do have a favorable map here. Democrats are defending more seats, and so it means that you're gonna see the Democrats are gonna have to win and defend more of their territory, whereas Republicans, the seats that they hold, are in generally pretty strong states for them. So we're gonna start by filling out the safe Democratic and Republican states. These are the states that they're going to go to either party by over 15% or just below 15%. Like if it's 14.9, I would basically classify it as safe. So as you can see here, to illustrate my point about this map being unfavorable for Democrats, they start off with a baseline of 30 or 27 seats or something. I can't remember. It was just up on the screen. In fact, we can just clear it really quickly just to see. 28, and Republicans are at 38. And as you can see, Democrats only get up to 39 seats when you add in all of the states that I have selected as safe. Some of these you could make an argument for likely, but they are functionally safe. Overall, Republicans are defending less territory, so they have a higher minimum. So, if Democrats won all of the Senate races up this year, which won't happen, Republicans would still have 38 seats. If Republicans won all of the seats that are up this year for the Senate, which, again, won't happen, they would have, a super majority of, 71 seats or something. Although Democrats would also have a super majority of 62 seats. But you can see here that the Democrats are defending more territory. Now, a lot of that territory is in safe blue states, but it's also in hyper-competitive states like Wisconsin, perennial battlegrounds like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada. But it's also in red states that Donald Trump won, like Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. But West Virginia, Joe Manchin, the Democrat turned independent incumbent, is retiring, and Jim Justice, the current Republican governor of the state, who used to be a Democrat but switched to being a Republican and is term limited, he's going to win the seat very handily. Not a competitive election at all. So that leaves us with 15 seats that I am not going to mark as safe. We're gonna, these videos tend to get very long, so I'm going to try my best to speed through them. The first two, I'm not going to go in any particular order, go from likely state to likely state by category, but I will generally, fill out all the likely states before I go to the lean states. So for Republicans, the two most obvious ones here are Nebraska and Missouri. Nebraska, this one has gotten a lot of buzz in the political arena as of late. Dan Osborne, the independent candidate who has the backing of most Democrats and a lot of independents in the state, is running pretty close to Deb Fischer in most polls that we see. We haven't had a lot of nonpartisan polling in here, but if you look down here at the history of the polls here, you can look at Fisher's own campaign poll from July, and it showed her up 26 points over Osborne. What does it say in the October version? She's only up by 6. Now, I think that Fisher's going to win by double digits. This is Nebraska. This is a state that Donald Trump won by almost 20 points in 2020. Fisher will definitely underperform Trump, and I think by a noticeable amount. But one thing that I want to make, but I do think it is notable that she is only leading by 6 in her own internal, and in Survey USA, which is generally a pretty, nonpartisan poll. Of course, this one is sponsored by Osborne's campaign, does show Osborne up by 1. And again, I really don't buy a lot of the hype for Osborne's campaign. I really don't think that he has that great of a chance of winning here. Even in a best case scenario, I would still say that he's losing to Fisher by 5 points. This is Nebraska. It's a very rural state. Yes, the Omaha area is growing, and there's a very, what's his name? Osborne's going to do very well there in 2024, and so will Kamala Harris and Tony Vargas, who looks like he's on track to defeat Republican incumbent Don Bacon in that district. But either way, Nebraska is still a very, very red state, and this reminds me a lot of the Utah race in 2022, where there was an independent who ran against the incumbent Republican and did fairly well. He only lost by 10 points in Utah, which is a state that has voted for Republicans historically by 30 to 40 points. It voted for Trump by only 21, in 2020. And when I say only 21, you kind of start to see how red the state is. But Nebraska, I think, will be a similar situation. Independents can do very well. It's, putting a race in play for the GOP that they really, don't need to have in play, but it's quite interesting. I still think Fisher's gonna win this race, but the fact that it's this close merits some discussion. Now, Missouri, this has been a pretty quiet race. Josh Hawley is running for a second term. I think he's going to underperform Trump by a couple of points here. He'll probably win by 12 against Lucas Coons, the Democratic nominee. I don't think he'll do particularly well in the St. Louis or Kansas City suburbs, but I think that generally Hawley's pretty safe here, but in terms of probability, but in terms of margin, it's going to be kind of close. Now, I'm going to go into the likely Democratic states. I'm going to move Minnesota down into the likely column, but very narrowly. We've just seen a lot of data that has suggested that Amy Klobuchar is in a bit closer of a race than expected, which is surprising given that, oh wow, they have a lot of polls here on 538. They had like nothing here just a couple of weeks ago. They have Klobuchar up by 11. That's what most of the polls have been saying. There have been some of these polls are showing like Harris within danger of losing Minnesota, which I don't think is going to happen. It was possible if she hadn't picked Walz, but since she did, I think that she's pretty safe here. Klobuchar, I just think, in terms of polarization, it is catching up to her, so I think she'll win by 13 or 14 points, maybe 12 or 13 to be safe. But she's going to lose a lot of ground relative to her 2018 numbers in rural Minnesota. But I think she'll improve in the suburbs, just as Democrats have been doing, and so that's going to boost her margin up. But this will be her closest Senate election yet. Then we go down to New Mexico. Martin Heinrich is going to win another term easily. Not a lot to talk about with this race. Pete Domenici's daughter is running in this, state. When Biden was in the post-Biden, pre-Kamala era, those 3 weeks of calls for Biden to drop out, it looked like New Mexico, which was getting closer on the presidential level, might get more competitive on the Senate level, but really there was no doubt that Heinrich was going to win this race. There was even a time where I think a lot of people saw it as safe blue. I think it's pretty clearly not in the safe blue column. But, Democrats rarely win by safe margins in New Mexico, but by probability, they are pretty safe here. And, Heinrich's a tried and tested incumbent. I don't expect him to lose by any stretch of the imagination. So then we're going to go to Virginia. This is another state that I think a lot of people expected to be safe. I think a lot of people still expect to be safe. Tim Kaine's easily going to win another term and outperform Kamala Harris. Wow, I didn't even look. I haven't looked at a lot of the 538 polling averages, I'll be honest with you. I've been looking more at RCP. But Kaine is up by 13 points. The most recent poll by Christopher Newport University showed him up by 20 points over Hung Kao, which, a lot of these more local Virginia polls I trust a little bit more. The Washington Post and George Mason University put out this poll that showed Kaine up by 12. I buy that. Emerson, I buy a Kaine plus 10 number. Kaine plus 6 from University of Mary Washington. That's a little close. But overall, I think Harris is pretty clearly favored in Virginia, and Tim Kaine is going to do even better than that. I never really thought his race it was never really a prime target of the GOP. There was always this hype about, Glenn Youngkin running for the seat, but obviously it was very clear a long time ago that he wasn't going to run. So yeah, I think Kaine wins by around 12 to 13 points. I agree with the polls here. And then we go to the state of Maryland. Now you might be wondering, why is Maryland competitive? Well, that's because, despite it being a state that Joe Biden won, that Joe Biden won by, that's Michigan. Despite Maryland being a state that Joe Biden won by over 30 points in the 2020 election, this is a competitive Senate race because the popular former Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, is running in this race. But if we know anything about popular former governors running for Senate in a state that leans heavily the other way, they don't usually win. If you looked back to 2018 and 2020, there were a couple of Democratic governors who ran for Senate who ran for Senate seats and lost to the Republicans, despite having won pretty impressive victories on the governor, on the gubernatorial level, and that's because governor races are more localized than Senate races. So Angela Alsobrooks, there have been a couple scandals about her. I think there's been some issue with her tax returns or something. I haven't had time to really look into it, but overall, polling in this race before the Democratic primary showed Hogan doing very well. And he's still doing very well for a Republican in Maryland. I mean, he was really the star recruit of the cycle for the GOP, but he just overall has not been able to overcome the partisanship of Maryland. And so I think that he could make this race within single digits. I think right now he's on track to lose by 10. But if polarization really sets in, he could lose by like 15 or 20 points. But I think right now, Maryland, semi-competitive, but Alsobrooks is the clear favorite, and that's not really a surprise to me. So then we're going to go into some of the more competitive likely states. We're going to go down to Florida really quickly. I did debate putting this in the lean column. There has been a lot of interesting data out of Florida that has suggested it's a little bit more competitive. There was kind of that point. I never really buy the presidential race being that competitive, but Rick Scott has not been very popular throughout his free past elections. He's won very narrow victories, but he always seems to find a way to win. Debbie Mercarzole-Powell, she's an okay candidate. She's a one-term congresswoman who lost to Carla, who lost her Miami-Dade congressional district to a Republican in 2020. But I think overall, she's made Democrats invest in this state. Gary Peters, the chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, said that Democrats would be investing in Florida and Texas for the first time in a while. First time in a while in Texas. Florida is usually a state that has drawn national Democratic support. That didn't happen in 2022, but it certainly is happening this year. I just think the polls in 2022 in Florida, unlike many other states, still overestimated Democrats, and by a pretty significant amount. I buy more so the polls by the New York Times, Siena, and Mason-Dixon polling strategy. I think Marist is a solid pollster, and I would not be surprised if we got, Mercarzole-Powell getting like 46, 47, 48% of the vote. But I think right now we're on track for, Scott +5 victory, closer than the presidential race will be. I want to make that point clear, but I think that it will be a little bit. It's a little bit more in the likely column than we think. I think it'll be like 5 or 6 points. I know that's basically what the average is saying, but it's still technically under the lean column. So that's where I stand on Florida right now. Then we're going to go up to Pennsylvania. This is a state that has narrowed recently. It narrowed in September for Democrats. Bob Casey long had a large lead here, and he still has a pretty comfortable lead, but the gap between him and Kamala Harris has been closing. When you look at the same polls, some of these polls only show Casey doing about a point better than Harris, which is a far cry from what was happening when Biden was in the race or when Harris initially entered the race. And I think McCormick's really benefited from a lot of outside spending coming into the state. He's really made Democrats fight for Pennsylvania, which, again, is a perennial battleground state, but Casey, overall, he's an institution in the state. Republicans were lacking a really good candidate for a long time, but when McCormick entered the race, they really got a fundraising juggernaut. Now, that doesn't erase a lot of McCormick's problems as a candidate, which are very similar to Dr. Oz. But Casey, I think should, for a while, I think Democrats were getting a little nervous about this race. I think they still should be. I mean, Emerson College only shows Casey up by 2. But again, these are much better polls for Casey than what John Fetterman was getting in mid to late October of 2022. And so I think that, and also John Fetterman won by 5 points in 2022 against Oz, and I really have a hard time seeing Casey underperforming that. You know, I think Harris is going to narrowly win Pennsylvania as of right now, but it's super close, and I think Casey will win by around 5 points. Similar situation. But yeah, this race could be a lean race. I did have it in lean last time, but I'm going to move it back up to likely. So 5.5 points, I would say, for Bob Casey. But still a closer race than it was just a couple of months ago. Then we're going to move over to the state of Montana. John Tester's just not been, doing well in recent polling data, and it's really not surprising. I mean, I expected, this race for a while had gotten, bad for Democrats. Throughout the summer, we saw some polls that showed Sheehy gaining an advantage after the June primary when Sheehy became the official GOP nominee. But even since then, I mean, the New York Times and Siena just came out with a Sheehy +8 poll. A bunch of Republican internals have been saying the same thing. RMG, which used to be a Republican-leaning pollster, but is a lot better now, shows Sheehy with a 7-point lead. But consistently, we've just been seeing Sheehy crossing that 50% threshold. The RCP average does show him with a majority of the vote. If we go down to Montana Senate, yeah, he's got 51% of the vote in the average. He's almost there in the 538 average. But overall, this race, I had it in lean Republican for a long time. I'm going to move it up to likely Republican. Tester's a really good candidate, but I think he's suffering the same flaw. He survived in 2018, which was a year where Democrats really lost a lot of their red state incumbents, like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Joe Donnelly in Indiana. But Tester had a really bad opponent in Matt Rosendale, who the GOP encouraged not to run again. He dropped out of the race, to be fair, after like a week of being in, but he was endorsed by Trump, and, he won the primary easily after Rosendale left. I mean, it was clear Rosendale wasn't going to win that primary because he had waited too long to announce his name. But overall, Montana, I think, is just a state where ticket splitting, Trump being on the ballot is really going to screw Tester. He's never had to run with Trump on the ballot. He has run in the Trump era, but that was during a blue wave year, and he only outperformed the Democratic candidate for Montana's at-large congressional seat by 7 points, and he won by 3 points. So Montana, we can look back at the results, actually. In the House election in 2018, this was when Montana only had one congressional district, Greg Gianforte won by only 5 points. Guess what happened in the same Senate election? Tester won by 4 points, which again is very is still a victory. It was still surprising to see him win in an era, in a year where a lot of red state Democrats lost their seats. But still, I mean, that was not a very large overperformance, and you can see his margin. I think early on in the election cycle, I argued that the fact that there was less. That there was more consistency in his margins, there wasn't as big of swings, made it likely that he was, he had a more stable coalition than, say, someone like Sherrod Brown in Ohio. But he's really just, fallen behind in the polls, and it's made Democrats wonder if they should target Texas or Florida, because those might be more attainable options, which honestly I don't, disagree with them in terms of the fact that Texas was closer than a lot of these red state I don't necessarily question or fault Democrats for thinking that Texas might be more competitive than Montana, because in 2018, Ted Cruz only won by less than, Beto O'Rourke lost by less than Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, who were all being protected by national Democrats. Meanwhile, Democrats didn't really put a dime into winning Texas. There was a lot of top buzz about it at the time, but it didn't really happen. And so that's, I think that at this point, I was a little cautious before, but I'm pretty, I think it's time to, shift Montana into the likely Republican column. Tester could still come back. Like, this is not a game over for him just yet, but it's looking really bad. And I think that he's just really not going to be able to overcome polarization. Some candidates can do it. Tester is the only Democrat who could win in this race, but he's just suffering from the times. And, the seat was eventually going to slip to the GOP anyway. And so while it's not a done deal yet, excuse me, while it's not a done deal yet for Tester, it looks pretty close to being. And I think as we get closer to election day, it's become, my uncertainty with this race is gonna, dwindle. I mean, I'm pretty confident right now that Sheehy's gonna win, and I think that a lot of people are too. That's not even talking about some of the allegations that Sheehy has made about, or some of the comments he's made allegedly about Native Americans, which could potentially drive up turnout that could help Tester with Native voters. But again, just it doesn't seem like enough, and the polls are very consistent, and this is a state that Trump won by 16 points. I don't think, it's a smaller media market than a state like Texas or Florida, so it might, in theory, be easier to win or to advertise there, but the partisanship is just, it's really going to be hard for Tester to overcome that, and I think that he's going to lose this time. So then we're going to go on to our final two likely states, Arizona and Nevada. These are two states that are very competitive in the presidential race. Trump currently has been leading in Arizona very consistently. In fact, in the New York Times/Siena poll that showed Gallego up by 7 against Kari Lake, Trump's up by 5, and that's really got me to reconsider Arizona on the presidential race. But Ruben Gallego has just had a massive lead in this Senate race, and Kari Lake's just, I think, really ruined her campaign by denying the results of her loss 2 years ago in the governor's election. And Democrats have really just been outspending Republicans by a massive amount here. And Lake's just really dug a hole for herself with her past comments, being an election denier. That just really doesn't play well in Arizona. And I think that despite the GOP trying to coalesce around her early to boost her chances, I mean, sometimes that works for some candidates, sometimes it doesn't. It clearly hasn't for Kari Lake, and I think Gallego is on track for a 5 to 6 point victory. This race has gotten one of the bright spots for Democrats in the Senate, in a year where they're at serious risk of losing control. And in fact, with Montana being added here, if Republicans win the presidency, they would have the vice presidency, which would allow them to break a tie in the 50-50 Senate. So if Trump wins the election, Republicans would already have the Senate. But obviously, it's not quite done yet, and we still got a couple states to fill out. But either way, let me stop rambling. Jackie Rosen in Nevada is doing very well. Similar situation to Arizona, where the polls are showing a much closer race in the presidential race, on the presidential side, than the Senate race. This Emerson/the Hill poll showed Harris up by 1. In the same poll, they show Rosen up by 8. This race has really gotten bad for Republicans, and they don't even have that bad of a candidate. Sam Brown, well, he had made some controversial statements during his 2022 campaign. He was, the National Party coalesced around him. The Republicans did a much better job at, avoiding primary, primary battles than they did in 2022. And while Adam Laxalt had a strong victory in Nevada in 2022 in his primary, he didn't really, wasn't to the same extent as Brown, who won basically every county. And so I think Rosen's just a stronger candidate. She's from a swing district, which, she won back in 2016 before she ran for Senate, and she beat a Republican incumbent in 2018 by 5 points. And again, that was a blue wave year, but still it was very impressive, very different from what the polls were saying. But overall, I think that this race has just gotten so bad for Republicans. Nevada and Arizona, the Southwest has just been terrible for them. And so I think that they really, while they've done well, they're doing better in states like Montana, they're just collapsing in Nevada and Arizona. Again, every state is different. So now we get down to the 4 states that I think will be decided by less than 5%. I think Rosen will win by like 5 or 6. I think she'll outperform Harris by a lot. And that's not typical of a candidate in Nevada. Usually Nevada's a pretty polarized state, and I wouldn't be surprised if this race narrowed down a little bit. But still, I think Rosen's going to outperform Harris by a good amount. As I was saying, we're down to our last 4 states. These are the states that I think are going to be decided by less than 5 percentage points. We're at 24 minutes, so I'm going to try and not zoom through these, but I have a tendency to ramble, so I'm going to go pretty fast. So the first state, the easiest one to start off with, is Texas. This race has gotten a lot closer in the last couple of in the last couple of weeks. Colin Allred has really made a comeback after Democrats kind of thought that his campaign was doomed, and Ted Cruz has really needed some help from this, from the national GOP. But Mitch McConnell and the Senate Leadership Fund have kind of been ignoring him and Rick Scott as Democrats try to invest here. And in fact, Gary Peters said, I think a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, that they're going to invest for Senate Democrats are investing in winning Texas for the first time since 2002, which is something that they didn't have in 2018 when, there may have been a lot of national buzz about Beto O'Rourke having a close race against Ted Cruz, but no outside money coming in. And in 2020, they certainly didn't when John Cornyn was winning. But Cruz is in trouble here. But again, Texas is a very big state. It's got a lot of there are a lot of different moving parts in the Texas political landscape, and I think that's why Democrats are having a harder time flipping it than Arizona or Georgia, which again are big in population, but are tiny compared to Texas, which has like 5 or 6 major metro areas. They have the Rio Grande Valley. They have all the rural areas, this and that. And Beto O'Rourke, while he was a strong he had a really strong performance here. The fact that Colin Allred is seemingly replicating that, but now is getting the financial support of national Senate Democrats, of Senate Democrats' campaign arm, I think that's really going to help him in this fight against Ted Cruz. I still think Cruz is going to win. It's still Texas. It's still a stubbornly Republican state. And Republicans had a very good year in 2022. But again, I think that it's another sign that Democrats are making inroads in Texas. I think that Harris will lose the state by less than 5 points on the presidential ballot, and I think Cruz could honestly drag Trump down a little bit. Now that being said, I still expect both of them, both the GOP to win both races, but I think Cruz's will be a lot more similar to 2 to 3 points, whereas Trump's will be more 4 to 5 points. But this race is getting close, and polls are consistently showing Cruz running behind Trump in terms of his vote shares, and Allred, his name recognition has really shot up, and I think that he's I think that a lot of people underestimated his ability to win this race. And so, I think Texas, that's where Texas stands, and Republicans now have a clear majority. In my prediction, they have 51 Senate seats because they've already flipped West Virginia and Montana and held on to every state that they already have. But the size of their majority is now in question. Democrats have 46 seats, Republicans have 51. So we're going to go through these last 3 states in the Midwest. We're going to start with Michigan. Michigan, I think, is the easiest of these 3 to knock out. Elisa Slotkin was in a more narrow race. It actually has gotten narrow again. It's kind of gone back and forth between the trend lines. In the late summer, it seemed like it was getting a little bit closer, and then in September, she had a bigger lead over Mike Rogers, but now it's kind of back in the toss-up range. But she's outperforming Harris, and she's generally Rogers has only one poll. He is starting to tie a couple. Trafalgar has shown it as a tie, and Trafalgar has a very bad track record in Michigan. I think they said Trump would win the state in 2020, and they said Tudor Dixon was going to beat Gretchen Whitmer in 22. Quinnipiac, that tied poll is not good, but overall insider advantage showing Slotkin up very bad for the GOP. Cook Political Report says Slotkin up by 4. Emerson says Slotkin up by 5. So it's pretty clear that Elisa Slotkin is the favorite to succeed Debbie Stabenow in this seat. Still a seat that Republicans would like to have, but honestly, they don't need it. Montana and Ohio are their bigger, and West Virginia. West Virginia, honestly, though, I don't even know if I need to mention because it's already gone for Democrats. Montana and Ohio are the ones that are really up in the air. Those are the ones that I think are the most competitive for the GOP. But Michigan, again, a state that they'd like to have, they don't necessarily need it. They haven't won a Senate race here in 30 years, and I don't think that's going to change. But it will be close. Michigan's Senate races in the last couple of years have been closer. So now we're going to go down to Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has gotten very, very close very, very fast. I still think Tammy Baldwin is a fairly clear favorite to win this race. She's outperforming Harris, just like many of these Senate Democrats, which, is not surprising. She has an established track record in this state, an electoral track record, and her legislative record. I think, she's pretty popular in Wisconsin. But Eric Hovde has really put this race back in the national spotlight. Democrats have overall won we're holding very big leads here in the state, in polling here. Just a couple of months ago in August, July and August, it looked like Republicans were really just falling behind here. Rasmussen had Baldwin up by 10. American Greatness had Baldwin up by 8. Fox News had Baldwin up by 11. But now we're seeing a little bit of a closer result. Trafalgar in August, late August, had Baldwin up by 6. Now they have her up by only 2. Insider Advantage has Baldwin up by 1. Emerson has Baldwin up by 4. New York Times Siena does show which has a very good track record in terms of Senate races, especially in the last 2 years. They have Baldwin up by 7. But again, this race has gotten a lot closer, and Republicans are set to outspend Democrats in the final stretch to Election Day, which could really tip the scales in favor of Hovde. I'm still very cautious in, I could put this in the toss-up column by Election Day, but I think Baldwin is still, favored to win by 2 to 3 points. This is the closest it's been, this race has been all year, and Democrats, I think, it's another sign that Democrats this year really need to focus more on defending the seats that they have right now, and kind of, not necessarily conceding the Senate, Senate majority to the Republicans, but just trying to focus on winning and defending as much as possible in the Rust Belt, and not trying to go out and win states that will be very hard. Because when you see numbers like this out of Wisconsin that are getting a lot closer than they were a month, 2 months, 3 months ago, it really puts into perspective, it really makes you reevaluate your priorities. So Democrats are at 48 Senate seats, Republicans are at 51. Ohio is a toss-up. It's really, really close. I really don't know how to put this race. I had it as tilt Democratic in my last prediction, but polls have been showing it getting closer. I will say that these same polls, like Washington Post and Marist, which show Trump up, around, by 6, are showing Sherrod Brown with a very, very narrow edge, but it's within the margin of error. This New York Times Siena poll, Brown being at 47%, that's great, but, I think that I, would say I have more confidence in his chances when you look at the Marist or the Washington Post polls. I think right now, Ohio is a state that voted for Trump by 8 points, which is a lot smaller than the margin that he won Montana by. But at the end of the day, Moreno may not be the best candidate, but I think that he's going to ride Trump's coattails. And if you shift these polls by like 2 points, let's say Trump wins Ohio by the same amount he did in 2020, Brown would lose. And I don't think that, Trump's going to necessarily lose ground in Ohio. It's possible. Vance is not the best VP running mate. You would think he would help him in Ohio, but I honestly don't think he's really going to have much of an impact, especially when he underperformed Trump in his Senate race against Tim Ryan. So I think that right now it's very close. Like, you can make an argument for Sherrod Brown, and I would take it. I really would. But I think I'm going to stick with partisanship here and just say that Sherrod Brown loses by the skin of his teeth. This is the closest Senate race. If Democrats win this, they really have a good chance at, if Republicans, lose this race, it's really going to be a boost for Democrats in terms of being able to maybe, call on Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski to oppose GOP legislation in a potential, Trump, second Trump term, which would, hurt GOP priorities. But overall, I think right now I'd call Moreno the very, very narrow favorite for the first time in, I think, a couple of months. We've seen improvements here, and we'll see what happens. Brown is still leading, but again, we have to remember that polls in 2020 underestimated Republicans in Ohio by a good amount. I believe the polls more so this year, especially when they're showing Trump up by a decent amount. I don't love, Trump plus 6 specifically, but it's a lot better than Trump plus 1 or, Biden plus 1, the kinds of polls we were getting in 2020. Overall, I'm just not gonna, I'm gonna stick with Moreno as the very narrow favorite, but Brown could, I could definitely change my prediction between now and election day. This is the closest Senate race by far. Not a question in my mind. So, with my final prediction, we see that Republicans retake the Senate. They flip West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana, and so they go from 49 Senate seats to 52 Senate seats, and Democrats hold on to the majority of their seats: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. But they end up with 48 seats, a pretty respectable, amount of, a pretty respectable number for a map, in a year where they have such an unfavorable map as this one. They could be losing Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada, and Republicans would be well over, would be close to a supermajority. But it is still a loss, and I think that it's a respectable performance for the Democrats, but at the end of the day, it's still a loss. It's just a really bad map for them, and I think that this is really going to, in a potential Kamala Harris presidency, this would really stifle her ability to confirm judicial nominees, cabinet nominees, and would really just put a thorn in the side. It would, if Democrats would win the House, it would just mean another, divided control, another 2 years of a divided Congress like we have right now. And I don't think really anyone wants that, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. But nonetheless, this is my prediction of what's going to happen, not what we want to happen. So, let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with me? Do you think that Republicans are gonna, take back the Senate this year after 4 years in the minority? Do you think I'm right about, the size of their majority? Do you think maybe Ohio is gonna flip, is gonna stay with the Democrats, or do you think it's gonna be an even larger majority for Republicans, like they're gonna win Wisconsin or Michigan or even Pennsylvania? Or do you think something crazy is gonna happen where Democrats are gonna win Texas or something? I really want to see what y'all think. Probably, I'll definitely make one more prediction, right before the election, on the Senate races. But overall, I may make another one in October. We'll just have to see what my schedule's like. But, thank you all so much for watching. Hit the like button, share the video with someone who you think would enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things politics. See ya.